Hello everyone, I'm glad you're here. Please like and subscribe so I can tell more interesting stories. Now let's get started. I was born Rosa Louise Macaulay on February 4th, 1913 in Tuskegee, Alabama. Yep, Tuskegee. That name rings different now, doesn't it? Back then, it wasn't just famous for experiments or airmen. It was a place where the air smelled of pine sap and people measured your worth by the shade of your skin. I was just a girl then, but I already knew something was off. I mean, imagine being 6 years old and already knowing you're not allowed to drink from certain water fountains. Childhood in Alabama had a way of speeding you into adulthood faster than you could tie your shoes. My parents, James and Leona, were hardworking. My mama was a teacher. Dad. He was a carpenter, the kind who could build a house from memory, but couldn't shield me from what was outside the door. When he left somewhere around when I turned 2, I learned what absence felt like. A father-shaped space in every room. We moved in with my grandparents in Pine Level, and that's where my real education began. Not just reading or writing, but how to survive being Black in the Deep South. We had a small house, creaky wood floors, and a front porch that cracked like old bones when we walked across it. My grandfather used to sit out there with a shotgun across his knees every night guarding the house, not from raccoons, from the Ku Klux Klan. Yeah, bedtime stories at our house were about staying low and praying loud. School was a strange place. I loved learning. I devoured books like they were candy, and I had fewer cavities with those. But the schools for Black children were always the leftovers. Secondhand books, tiny buildings, and teachers who stretched themselves like rubber bands. One of the few photos I have from then is me in a too-big dress standing outside the schoolhouse like I owned it. Spoiler alert, I didn't. We weren't even allowed new desks. I remember riding to school and passing the gleaming white buildings of schools for white kids. They had sports fields, libraries, buses. We had hope and some very dedicated teachers. Still, there was something about the injustice that gnawed at me early on. Not like rage, more like an itch just behind your ribs. You can't scratch it, but you know it's there. Now here's a fun, weird fact. When I was about 10, I became obsessed with making paper dolls. I'd draw them cut out little outfits and act out these glamorous stories in my head. They always lived in a world without whites-only signs. Paper paradise. Historians still debate whether early childhood role play like this can subconsciously prepare kids for larger acts of resistance. All I know is in my world of paper dolls, everybody could sit wherever they wanted. We didn't have much, but we had dignity. Mama made sure of that. She ironed clothes until midnight to keep me in school, even though I had to drop out eventually to take care of my grandma and mom when they got sick. That's what Black girls did back then. Dreams came second to duty. But even with dreams on pause, I never stopped watching, never stopped noticing. Montgomery, Alabama was a strange stew of genteel Southern charm and ruthless racial laws. You could smell jasmine in the air and still hear someone hiss, "Don't get uppity." I wasn't a loud child. I didn't throw punches. I wasn't leading marches in my Sunday shoes. But I was absorbing everything, filing it away. And here's one for the off-topic jar. I once got stung by a wasp during a Sunday picnic and managed to say absolutely nothing because I didn't want to ruin the prayer circle. I just stood there, lips trembling, hands swelling. Later I realized that same silence, the kind that hurts you while preserving the peace, was exactly what they wanted from us every day. By the time I was a teenager, I'd already made up my mind about some things. I didn't know the details yet, didn't know the how or the when, but I knew I wouldn't spend my life stepping off the sidewalk to let someone else pass, that whole stay-in-your-place routine. Yeah, that wasn't going to be my script. Even the church, which offered some comfort, carried the burden of expectation. Be patient, child. God will deliver us in time. But I couldn't help but wonder, was God waiting for us to move first? We had codes in our community. Don't talk back. Don't look white folks in the eye too long. Don't get too comfortable, even if you're tired. Tired wasn't an excuse. And yes, that part will come back later. So that's how my early years went, learning, watching, absorbing, knowing too much for someone so young, but also not yet understanding the weight of what I would someday carry. I wasn't born to be famous. I was born to be small, quiet, proper. But the world had other plans, and so did I. They say tailoring teaches patience, but I say it teaches resistance. After I left school to take care of my sick family members, I picked up sewing little stitches, at first hemming curtains, patching church dresses. By the time I was in my early 20s, I was a seamstress with a client list that included everyone from ministers' wives to Montgomery's most proper society ladies. Funny, isn't it? These women would hand me their finest garments and trust me to make them flawless, even though they wouldn't let me use their front door. I worked at a department store downtown, stitching, pressing, fitting clothes for people who wouldn't meet my eyes. There's a special kind of humility in sewing someone's clothes while they treat you like wallpaper, every thread, every fold, like I was sewing their authority right into the fabric. I married Raymond Parks in 1932. He was a barber, sharp dresser, smooth talker. He wore his hat tilted just so, and he had this calm but fierce energy, like a man who had seen too much and chose to be brave anyway. He was active in the NAACP before I even knew how deep the rabbit hole went. He introduced me to people who weren't afraid to speak up. People like E.D. Nixon, who looked at injustice the way a locksmith looks at a jammed door, something to unlock, not avoid. Now, Raymond didn't just cut hair, he organized, he advocated. He helped defend the Scottsboro Boys, 9 black teenagers falsely accused of assault. That case lit a fire in us, and soon I joined the NAACP too. Not in some big flashy way. I started by writing letters, organizing records. I became the secretary, which basically meant I did everything from meeting notes to fundraising flyers. But every meeting was a masterclass in resistance. There's this one bizarre memory that always sticks with me one night at an NAACP meeting. The power went out and we kept going anyway, passing notes back and forth by candlelight like some secret society. It felt dangerous and sacred all at once. Historians still debate whether those grassroots meetings did more to ignite the civil rights movement than the big speeches ever could. I say, absolutely. And you know what else happened? During those years, I developed a deep, chronic dislike for whites-only signs. They were everywhere. On bus seats, drinking fountains, lunch counters, even libraries. I remember one afternoon, I tried to check out a book and was told I'd have to go to the colored branch. It was the same book, same author, same worn-out spine, but apparently my hands were too brown to touch it. One hot July afternoon, I was running errands downtown when I got caught in a sudden downpour. I ducked under an awning beside a group of white folks who looked at me like I had spat in their coffee. I stepped back into the rain. I remember thinking, this is what it means to be black in the South. You'd rather be soaked to the bone than soaked in their contempt. And then there were the buses. Oh, the buses. You haven't truly experienced slow humiliation until you've boarded a Montgomery City bus as a black woman. You paid your fare at the front, then stepped off and reboarded at the back because you weren't allowed to walk through the white section. That alone was a dance of discomfort. Many times the drivers would take your money and then drive off before you could reboard. Yep, left you standing in the street like a ghost. I can't count how many times that happened. There was one driver in particular, James Blake. You'll hear about him later. Tall guy, white, mean as a snake on a griddle. We'd had an encounter in 1943 where he yanked me off his bus for refusing to reboard through the back. I avoided his route after that. But fate, as we know, has a sense of humor. Still, every day I got on that bus. Every day I paid my dime and sat where I was told. Sometimes the colored section was full, and we had to stand while empty seats stayed empty in the white zone. You try doing that 5 days a week with groceries in your arms and a full work shift behind you. It's not just physical exhaustion. It's a soul kind of tired. You know, I once read that lobsters don't scream when boiled because they don't have vocal cords. That's how I felt some days, boiling on the inside, silent on the outside. Just steam and quiet fury. Raymond and I never had children, but we poured ourselves into the movement. We spent evenings strategizing, weekends delivering flyers, and mornings praying we'd make it through the week without someone we knew getting arrested, or worse. And yet, the world kept spinning like nothing was wrong. There were times I wanted to scream, other times I wanted to disappear, but most of the time, I just sewed. Stitch by stitch, I held my sanity together. One night, I stayed up hemming a white church dress and realized I was spending more time on appearances than justice. That's when something shifted inside me. I wasn't going to burst, I was going to hold. And holding meant preparing for the day I wouldn't stand up when they asked me to. December 1st, 1955. I remember that morning, cold, dry air, the kind that bites your cheeks and makes the pine trees seem sharper than usual. I had spent the day working at the Montgomery Fair department store, hemming sleeves and pretending not to notice the glares. My feet ached, my back hummed with fatigue, and my hands smelled like starch and thread. But none of that was unusual. What was unusual was the feeling I had when I stepped onto that Cleveland Avenue bus that evening. I wasn't looking to make history. I wasn't even looking to make trouble. I was just tired, and not just bone tired, soul tired, that kind of tired where your breath feels too heavy for your chest. James Blake was driving. Yes, that James Blake, the one who'd thrown me off his bus more than a decade earlier. I saw his face, and for a moment thought about stepping off. But something stopped me, something small, maybe pride, maybe spite, maybe fate. So I paid my fare, walked to the colored section in the middle, and sat down in the first row of seats allowed for us. 3 other black passengers joined me. Now let's get something straight. I wasn't sitting in the white section. I was in the middle section, the so-called colored buffer zone. And yet when the white section filled up and more white riders boarded, Blake turned around and barked at us to give up our seats. 2 stood, I didn't. I slid closer to the window, calm, quiet. I wasn't planning a protest. I wasn't rehearsing a speech. In fact, the only speech I remember from that moment was Blake's, "If you don't stand up, I'll have to call the police." And I said, "You may do that." That's it. That's the big rebellious quote that got carved into history books and scrawled across posters. Not power to the people, not let freedom ring, just "you may do that." Like I was telling a child to go ahead and tattle. Historians still debate whether I had planned it. Some say it was strategic. Others claim it was a spontaneous act of fatigue. I say it was both. Years of watching, waiting, absorbing. And finally, a quiet no. Not shouted, not screamed, just stated like a fact that had been true all along. Blake called the police. 2 officers came. I stayed seated. One asked me why I wouldn't stand. I looked him square in the eye and asked, "Why do you all push us around?" He said, "I don't know. But the law's the law, and you're under arrest." They took my purse, my dignity, and my fingerprints. They charged me with violating the city's segregation laws. But what they really arrested me for was not knowing my place. Here's a bizarre twist for you. While I was in jail, my dinner that night was meatloaf and canned peas. Seriously, history pivoted while I ate school cafeteria food on a metal tray. Doesn't that feel strange? The whole world would later turn that day into legend, and I was just chewing in fluorescent lighting. E.D. Nixon bailed me out. He'd been waiting for a moment like this, someone with a clean record, a solid reputation, and the right demeanor to challenge the system in court. I fit the bill, me and my quiet refusal. The news spread fast. Montgomery's black community was electric with whispers. I heard someone on the street call me the spark. I didn't feel like a spark. I felt like a woman whose feet still hurt and who had to return to work the next day, pretending nothing happened. But nothing would be the same again. People began organizing. That weekend, a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. was asked to lead a boycott. I'd heard of him, sharp dresser, calm voice, dangerous ideas. We met, and I liked his resolve. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't looking to be a star. He was just focused, like someone who knew the exact weight of silence. The Montgomery Improvement Association was formed, and I was now not just a seamstress, but a symbol. Funny how people start treating you like a statue the moment you sit still. Now let me take you on a weird detour. You know what else happened that week? Someone at the department store accidentally switched the price tags on a whole rack of suits, putting the expensive ones at half price. A frenzy broke out. I always wondered if that chaos was some cosmic metaphor. Prices dropped, expectations flipped, and people walked away with more than they came for. Back to the boycott, folks stopped riding the buses. They walked miles, in the cold, in church clothes and worn-out shoes. Black maids, barbers, teachers, preachers, janitors, students, all walking. It wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. The quiet kind of revolution you feel in your knees. They offered me rides, but I walked too when I could. Not because I liked blisters, but because I couldn't ask others to suffer for a stand. I wouldn't take myself. We formed carpools, passed out flyers, made sandwiches, and every time a bus rolled by with empty seats, we smiled like we were winning a silent game of chicken. Some nights, I lay awake, wondering what I had started. Some nights, I felt like a pebble that started an avalanche. Other nights, I was just Rosa, too tired to fold laundry, too wired to sleep. The buses were quieter now, but Montgomery buzzed like never before. They fingerprinted me again the next week. This time, it wasn't just for sitting. It was for making a ruckus, apparently. The city decided to push back hard. They dragged me into court and found me guilty of violating segregation laws. A $10 fine and $4 in court fees, that's what they thought my dignity cost. I didn't pay. I appealed. Now let's be clear, that appeal wasn't just about me. It was about us. My case became a legal test balloon tied to the whole Montgomery bus boycott. If I won, segregation cracked. If I lost, they hoped the resistance would deflate. But the thing is, we were already done deflating. The boycott was on fire. People were walking. That might sound like a small thing now, but imagine it. Imagine walking 5, 10, even 20 miles a day just to avoid handing a dime to a system that treated you like the gum on its shoes. School teachers in high heels, factory workers in muddy boots, grandparents leaning on canes, all of them walking. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was relentless, like a heartbeat you couldn't ignore. We made carpool systems that were so organized they ran smoother than city buses. We had volunteer drivers, dispatchers, maps, basically Uber without the app. And the churches, oh, the churches kept it all alive. Sunday sermons turned into strategy meetings. Gospel songs turned into fuel. You could hear Aretha Franklin's Daddy C.L. Franklin on the radio, preaching justice like it was scripture. Of course, the city didn't like this. White taxi drivers started charging full fares to black passengers. Insurance companies canceled policies on carpool drivers. Police began pulling us over for failing to signal a lane change or looking suspicious. You know traffic violations from the Twilight Zone. But we didn't stop. One of my favorite bizarre moments from that winter, a woman told me her shoes completely fell apart from walking every day. Instead of buying new ones, she tied them together with string and kept going. The Lord didn't say my shoes had to be pretty, she told me, just that I had to keep walking. Historians still debate whether the boycott's success was because of big speeches or small sacrifices like that one. Me, I think it was the string. Meanwhile, back in my personal life, things weren't so inspirational. Raymond lost his job. I was let go from Montgomery Fair Bad attitude, they said. Being a national symbol doesn't come with a salary, and the bills didn't care if you were Rosa Parks. Sometimes we had just enough food, sometimes we didn't. We leaned on family, leaned on friends. Pride had to take a back seat. Not that I could afford a seat. There were nights when our phone wouldn't stop ringing, anonymous threats, vile insults, heavy breathing. Sometimes they'd just whisper, "You're gonna die," then hang up. We unplugged it after a while. I learned to sleep with one eye open and a baseball bat by the bed. But here's the thing. I wasn't scared the way they wanted me to be. I was annoyed. Like when a mosquito keeps buzzing at your ear. I'd spent my whole life being told to be quiet. Sit down. Step aside. That phone ringing off the hook. It wasn't fear. It was the sound of the old world cracking. Then came the legal battles. Martin E.D. Nixon and the rest of the Montgomery Improvement Association kept the pressure on the courts. My case was moving slowly, but another federal case, Browder v. Gale, was gaining momentum. That one argued that bus segregation violated the 14th Amendment. You know, that old dusty promise of equal protection under the law. While the judges debated and the lawyers strategized, we kept walking. By now it had been months. Shoes were worn thin. Spirits weren't. Here's a weird off-topic fact to lighten the mood. During one of those boycott meetings, someone brought in a cake shaped like a bus. I kid you not. It had licorice wheels and gumdrop headlights. The message on top read, "Drive this." We laughed so hard we cried. Sometimes humor is the only protest your soul can afford. By November 1956, the courts finally made their decision in Browder v. Gale. They ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. The city appealed. Then, on December 20th, the Supreme Court upheld the ruling. That was it. Victory. No more back-of-the-bus nonsense. The next day, Martin and I and a few others rode the bus together, sat wherever we wanted. People stared. Some smiled, some scowled, but no one told us to move. Not that day. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't the end. It was just one door swinging open in a long hallway of locked ones. But oh, what a sound that door made. Of course, not everyone threw us a parade. Some white folks boycotted the buses, now claiming reverse discrimination. Some black folks felt the pressure of retribution. Jobs were still lost, houses still burned, but the line had been drawn and we'd crossed it. Back at home, Raymond and I sat at the kitchen table, drinking weak coffee and talking about what came next. I was still jobless, still tired. But something was different. My body ached, but my spine felt stronger than ever. And no, I never did get an apology from James Blake. He lived his whole life claiming he was just doing his job. I suppose we were both doing our jobs that day. Mine just happened to include shaking a nation. The boycott was over, but the backlash was just getting started. It's funny how people expect everything to go back to normal after a victory, like the victory is supposed to clean up the mess too. But the truth, winning made things harder, especially for me. I couldn't get work anywhere in Montgomery. Department stores suddenly had no openings. Seamstress gigs vanished. Even some people in our own community kept their distance. Too much attention, they whispered, like I had turned radioactive. Raymond and I were exhausted, financially, emotionally, spiritually. And I'll admit it, we argued more. Not loud arguments, but quiet ones. The kind where silence stretches too long between sips of coffee. We loved each other, but we were both frayed at the edges. Eventually, we left Montgomery and moved north to Detroit, Michigan. Now let me just say, if Montgomery was a slow burn, Detroit was a furnace. Different flavor of racism, same bitter aftertaste. Up north, it wore a suit and tie. It didn't tell you to move to the back of the bus. It just didn't stop the bus at your corner. I got a job at first stocking clothes at a small store, but even that didn't last. Raymond struggled too. We were better off than before, but barely. We weren't thriving. We were surviving. I volunteered when I could. worked odd jobs. I cleaned houses, sewed quietly, and kept organizing behind the scenes. Because if you think one bus ride made me a hero, you haven't been paying attention. Detroit had its own problems: police brutality, housing discrimination, school inequality, and racism that acted like it had a college degree. I joined Congressman John Conyers' staff in the 60s. It didn't pay much, but it gave me purpose. I was helping constituents, writing letters, solving real problems. Not glamorous, but vital. And yes, I met Malcolm. Yes, I worked with Dr. King again. No, we didn't always agree. And yes, I still carried that same purse from 1955. You want a bizarre moment from this time? One afternoon in Detroit, I was walking to the grocery store when a young man asked me for directions. I gave them, and he said, "Thanks, Miss Parks." I smiled, thinking he recognized me. Then he said, "My grandma talks about you like you were Harriet Tubman's cousin." I laughed the whole walk home. Historians still debate whether younger generations truly grasp what the boycott meant. Maybe not, but at least their grandmas are talking. Still, Detroit was lonely. I wasn't Rosa Parks, the activist here. I was Rosa Parks, the woman in line at the bakery. And while I appreciated the anonymity, sometimes it also hurt. I didn't do what I did for fame, but it stung to be forgotten while others cashed in on the movement's image. In 1965, Bloody Sunday happened in Selma. I cried watching it. Cried the way someone cries when they see their pain recycled. Same struggle, different decade. I called it the long battle wrapped in new banners. Raymond's health declined. My mother passed. I was now alone in a new city, more myth than person. The world had made me a symbol, but symbols don't get sick days. I was expected to smile at events, speak with grace, wear that invisible crown. I did my best, but the loneliness, it never fully left. There was one time I gave a speech to a mostly white audience, and afterward a woman told me I was so well-spoken, so soft-spoken, for someone who made such a loud noise. I nodded politely. What I wanted to say was, you don't need to shout to shake the earth. I never got rich, didn't write a tell-all, didn't start a brand, but I watched the movement grow new wings, freedom riders, sit-ins, marches, court rulings, and I watched some of those same wings get clipped: assassinations, infiltrations, disappointments. Still, we moved forward. By the 1970s, more people were talking about intersectionality. I liked that word because, yes, I was Black, but I was also a woman, a poor woman, an older woman, and all of those identities came with doors that didn't open easily. Now let's veer off-road for a second. Did you know I loved peanut butter on saltine crackers every night before bed? One little ritual that made me feel human. In a world that treated me like a symbol, I needed something ordinary. As the years passed, honors trickled in. Schools were named after me. Streets, awards, invitations. A seat at the table finally, though. Sometimes I wondered if it was just for show. Still, I showed up. Because presence matters. Dr. King once said, faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. Well, I never saw the staircase. I just knew I couldn't stand still on the step I was given. And in Detroit, in that little apartment with fading wallpaper and quiet nights, I kept moving one step at a time. There's a strange kind of echo that comes with aging, a hum between the past and the present. By the 1980s, I had become what people called a living legend, which sounds flattering until you realize it often means a historical artifact who still breathes. People smiled when they saw me asked for autographs, but sometimes they forgot I was still living through the very world I had fought to change. The truth is, not much felt legendary about overdue rent and aching joints. My apartment was modest, too modest if you ask me. Peeling linoleum drafty windows, a rattling fridge that sounded like it was groaning in sympathy. But it was home, and home is where I reflected on my choices, my regrets, my triumphs. I didn't keep trophies. I didn't have a shrine. What I had were memories wrapped in fabric scraps, NOACP, meeting notes folded in old shoeboxes, and a heart that still thudded at every news headline with the words, racial unrest. I kept working too. I volunteered at community centers, helped at youth programs, wrote letters to families whose kids were in trouble with the law. I wasn't marching anymore, but I was mentoring. You see, legacy isn't just about grand speeches. It's also about small gestures, repeated until they shape someone's spine. One day, in 1992, I was assaulted in my own home. A man broke in, demanded money. I gave him $10. He hit me hard. I remember the taste of blood in my mouth and the smell of old carpet against my cheek. It was a cruel reminder that no matter how historic you become, there will always be people who see only weakness in your skin. That moment broke something in me, but not what you might think. It didn't make me bitter. It made me more aware, more determined to make sure women like me, Black poor aging, weren't left behind in the retelling of civil rights history. Because history can be a slippery thing. It polishes people, sands off the rough edges, turns you into a statue, a lesson plan. But I wasn't a statue. I still laughed, especially at absurd things. Like the time I was invited to an event where they served freedom fries. Yes, someone renamed French fries to honor me. I said, what a way to start a revolution, deep fried potatoes. That joke landed me a standing ovation. Go figure. Now here's your off-topic oddity. I had a pet canary for a few years in the 90s, named it Justice. That little bird chirped like it had something to say about every injustice in the world. Drove me half crazy, but I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Justice is noisy, I used to say. Better get used to it. And yet through all the noise and the nostalgia, I stayed humble. Maybe too humble. I turned down big offers to license my name. Didn't want to become a brand. I saw others do it. No judgment, but that just wasn't me. I didn't want people to remember Rosa Parks, Inc. I wanted them to remember Rosa Parks, the woman who said no and meant it. Historians still debate whether I did enough after the boycott, whether I disappeared into the background, let others carry the torch. Some even suggested I was used by the movement, a pawn in a larger strategy. To that, I say, maybe. But I knew what I was doing. I chose to remain steady, grounded. I wasn't trying to be a headline. I was trying to live with honor. Eventually, time caught up with me. My bones creaked. My breath grew shorter, but my eyes still held fire. I watched children play in integrated parks, watched biracial couples hold hands downtown without fear. I watched politicians talk about equality while still dodging real questions. Progress is slow, sometimes painfully so, but it walks forward if enough people push behind it. Raymond passed in 1977. Mama went before that. Afterward, it was just me. Some days I talked to the walls. Other days I talked to young activists. They'd come visit, eager, fresh, still smelling like protest signs and printer ink. They asked me for advice. I'd say, sit down when they expect you to stand up and stand tall when they expect you to shrink. And they'd nod like I'd handed them gold. But what I handed them was grit. When I turned 80, someone threw me a surprise party. I walked in and saw faces, young, old, black, white, every hue. They sang happy birthday, and I cried. Not because I was touched, but because they knew who I was. Not the symbol, me. Later that night, I sat by the window, watching streetlights flicker like fireflies. I thought about the girl I used to be, Rosa Louise Macaulay, who learned to sew, to pray, to keep quiet. And I whispered to her, you did good, baby. Because sometimes you have to remind your younger self that surviving was the first revolution. By the time I turned 90, I had long stopped trying to keep up with how many awards I'd received. Presidential medals, keys to cities' honorary degrees, I never got to earn. The regular way, people handed me flowers, plaques, even a few checks now and then. I appreciated them truly, but none of them felt as meaningful as the faces I'd see at schools named after me. Brown-skinned little girls with notebooks and questions, boys who'd whisper, I told my mom about you. That was the legacy I cherished. I had become a sort of quiet thunder, loud only when people bothered to really listen, a woman whose power came not from her voice, but from her refusal to lower it. I had no need to scream. My no had already echoed around the world. In 2000, I was honored at the Lincoln Memorial. I stood there in front of those towering stone columns, the same place where Dr. King had said, "I have a dream." And I thought, Lord, I was never trying to make history. I was just trying to get home that day. It's strange. The older you get, the less the big stuff matters. Not because it isn't important, but because you finally see what really changed the world. It wasn't just one bus ride. It was the thousands of people who got up the next morning and walked anyway. The women who cooked double to feed neighbors. The men who lost their jobs and still showed up to carpool. The kids who grew up watching all of it and remembered. Those were the real heroes. I was just the spark. And still, even in my final years, the fight wasn't over. I watched the Rodney King footage. I watched cities erupt in grief and anger. I watched new generations rise with old wounds. And I kept thinking, how long must we walk? But I also saw hope. I saw people marching again, not in suits and Sunday shoes, but in sneakers and hoodies. Different look, same fire. I saw young girls tweeting about justice, creating whole movements with a phone and a mission. I didn't understand all the technology, but I recognized the spirit. That part never changes. Here's a final strange fact. I always kept a small suitcase packed under my bed, just in case. Not for danger, but for purpose. A hat, a good dress, some church shoes, a notepad. You never know when you'll be asked to show up for history again, and I wanted to be ready. Historians still debate what the exact tipping point of the civil rights movement was, whether it was my arrest, Emmett Till's, or death the Brown v. Board. Let them debate. They all mattered. Every moment was a match to dry kindling. My match just happened to catch. When I passed away in 2005, I was given the rare honor of lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda. The first woman, the first Black American ever. People lined up for hours, children, elders, strangers. I don't remember any of it, of course, but I like to imagine the silence in that space, that hushed reverence. I hope someone whispered she just wanted to sit down. And I hope someone else whispered back, she made the whole world stand up. If you remember me, don't remember me as a statue. Remember me as the woman whose feet hurt after work, as the lady who packed peanut butter crackers for lunch, as the girl who sewed clothes and wondered if justice was real. I wasn't extraordinary. I was prepared. I didn't change the world. We did. And I'm proud to have sat still long enough for everyone to notice. Our words count 192. Closing reflection. Soft whisper. Approx. 300 words. Now, if you're still here with me, let's slow down for a moment. Let your breath settle, your shoulders fall, your thoughts grow quiet. Rosa Parks didn't walk through fire or carry a flag into battle. She simply sat still when the world told her to move. And that stillness, firm, unflinching, rippled through time like the quiet rumble of distant thunder. The courage she carried wasn't loud. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't always come with applause. Sometimes it came with loneliness, with hunger, with fear. But still she showed up, day after day, stitch after stitch, step after step. And that kind of presence, that quiet defiance, is often the kind that endures the longest. So the next time someone tries to tell you your voice is too soft, your presence too small, your protest too simple, think of her. Think of the seat she refused to surrender, the silence she filled, the movement she helped awaken, not by standing, but by sitting still. And remember, legacy isn't always what you leave behind. It's what you refuse to leave unsaid. Thank you for being here. I hope you sit with this story a while. And when you rise, rise with purpose.